Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is The Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, journalist Paul Wells endured 6 weeks of Public Order Emergency Commission testimony. We talk about the big picture of the convoy and the government's response to it straight ahead.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hello and welcome to you all. This is The Andrew Lawton Show, Canada's most irreverent talk show here on True North. As we near the holidays, we are taking advantage of there being a bit of a lull in the news and talking about some of the big picture ideas, going in depth with some of our guests in a way we don't often get to when we're covering the news of the day. And today I wanted to revisit the Public Order Emergency Commission, which, as you know, dominated much of my personal time and also the time of this show for October and November, and I think it was done in November. Yeah, it just felt like it lasted a lot longer. And this was the commission that over a 6-week period really laid bare the details of the convoy, the police response, the city of Ottawa, the province of Ontario, the federal government, how all of these different groups intersected and how they all discussed and viewed this event, which everyone can agree was an important thing, but few sides could really agree on the fundamental facts of. And that was why it was so interesting. Now, there were aspects of this that weren't as intriguing to me. For example, I was not personally as interested in the Windsor and Coutts stories because my focus of coverage had obviously been on what was happening in Ottawa, which is, I think, what really was the trigger for the Emergencies Act, given that the Windsor and Coutts blockades had been cleared well before or were underway in being cleared when the Emergencies Act came in. So I think that at the same time, it's fascinating to me to take this bigger picture look because polling has actually showed that Canadians think after this whole thing, the federal government came out ahead. Now, is this because the poll was wrong? That's possible. Or is it because there was a story that was missing that Canadians weren't having access to? That's my inclination here, that the media might have played a pretty key role in this. But I wanted to talk about this with a journalist who doesn't necessarily view the convoy the way I do, but has, I think, a very sharp eye and very strong BS detector about this. And as I mentioned, went through the entire process and followed this, and I think picked up a lot of key details along the way. And that is journalist Paul Wells, formerly of Maclean's. Now he runs a great Substack over at paulwells.substack.com and hosts the Paul Wells Show over at the Toronto Star, and also has a short book coming out through my publisher, Sutherland House, and its new periodical, Sutherland Quarterly, and that's dealing exactly with this topic that we're discussing now, the Public Order Emergency Commission. Paul, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you doing? Keeping warm in Ottawa?
Yeah. I was in Calgary for several days, and it was freaking cold there. So it's a little rainy today, but I'll take it.
Sounds good. I wanted to start off by talking about the Public Order Emergency Commission. Now, you did what not a lot of people could withstand, which was following along very closely these very long days, days that dragged, a lot of very heavy detail in the testimony, and then even more in the actual documents. And you managed to find the energy to write about this after slogging through it all. And you did so, and I'm always amazed with you at how quickly you can churn out copy when things happen. But I was wondering if you could speak to the why first and foremost, because like my interest in the commission came about from my interest in the convoy, which I was very invested in covering earlier in the year. What was your attachment to this story?
So, long-term sustained coverage of an institutional clash, like a trial, is a form in journalism. And I was, as the convoy got started, I think after I wrote my first piece, I was talking with our friend Ken White, who was my editor at Maclean's, published your book about the convoy. And I was reminiscing about how he used to be so impressed in the 90s when the O.J. Simpson trial was happening, and it lasted for many, many months. And Dominic Dunn, the great American writer, covered it monthly for Vanity Fair, and there'd be 4,000 words every month about the latest events in the O.J. Simpson trial. And Christy Blatchford at the National Post used to cover all sorts of trials. And eventually also the Gomery Commission of Inquiry into the sponsorship scandal, which I covered for a much shorter amount of time as one of several people writing for Maclean's. So it's a forum. You have to be able to put up with a lot of boring material. You have to find the connections between material. So it's very much Ken talked me into keeping it up, and the idea was it was a conscious tribute to the kind of work that Christy Blatchford used to do for us and that Dominic Dunn used to do, and that courthouse reporters have done forever. The conflict at the center of the thing is incredibly lively. The form and the setting is really not, and you have to figure out how to find the drama in the extended event.
It's funny you mention that, because obviously when you watch like a courtroom drama in a movie, when that moment comes up that just shocks people, there's dramatic music and everyone in the room gasps. There were a few moments that came up during the commission testimony where some bombshell will happen and it's like, wait, did I hear that right? Was that what I thought it was? And sometimes these things are very fleeting and they don't actually get any acknowledgement in the moment. And you plucked a few of those out.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the ones, which funnily enough, having said all this, I actually didn't attend, was when the head of CSIS said that this event did not meet the CSIS test for being a public order emergency, which to some extent the government witnesses spent the rest of the commission trying to sort of explain that pretty blatant apparent contradiction. And then the testimony of Peter Slowly, which I thought was fascinating, because it's another thing that happens in drama. Peter Slowly was, until partway through this, the chief of the Ottawa Police, and no one liked him and no one thought he was effective. And suddenly he testifies, and his testimony was quite compelling and believable. And then that was on a Friday. On the Monday following, it falls apart because the cross-examination comes, and his testimony doesn't really stand up to any cross-examination. So that was a kind of an interesting dramatic moment. And Chrystia Freeland, I actually haven't written about this on my newsletter, but I'm going to go over it in the book. She talks about how she discussed the economic impact of the border blockings at cabinet, and the numbers she was throwing around were just orders of magnitude larger than the numbers her own department was coming up with, like the real cost of the Ambassador Bridge and the Coots border crossings were nowhere close to what Chrystia Freeland thought they were. She had kind of misunderstood the numbers. And to me, that shows that anyone's appreciation of the legalities of this stuff is very approximate. And it's not really based on a careful reading of a test. It's, do we feel like using this Emergencies Act or do we not? I think that's what it came down to.
Yeah, and then come up with an excuse later. And not that I extrapolate too much from Twitter, and I think you were very wise to get away from Twitter many years ago, but on Twitter, the sense that I saw from a lot of the federal government's defenders was basically, we didn't like the convoy, the government invoked the Emergencies Act, and then the convoy was gone in a few days, therefore we're fine with the Emergencies Act. And there didn't really seem to be, from the outsider support anyway, this even concern for what the laws were and whether it was legally justified. They were just happy with the outcome. Yeah.
And you and I might disagree about the extent to which this is true, but there was a lot not to like about the convoy. I mean, there were some, it caused a lot of chaos in people's lives. It was loud forever. It was, and then the question is, what's the appropriate remedy to that? But I do think it's true, and I certainly think it's true, the federal government, more than the other players in this thing, decided what the story was before they observed the unfolding of the event. You have government communication staffers discussing essentially narrative before there are trucks in Ottawa, or before there's protesters' trucks in Ottawa. And once you've done that, I mean, there's people in Ottawa, I think of the former journalist Ellie Alboim, has written really thoughtfully about how if you become invested in a narrative, then you resist integrating new information that conflicts with that narrative. So if you think that these truckers are monolithic, antagonistic, and dangerous, then it becomes hard to swallow any information to the effect that some of them were, but some of them weren't. They sure weren't monolithic. There was infighting that, first of all, shows that it was a complex human event, and secondly, if you were trying to undo the convoy, that might have actually come in handy. But the very strong impression you get from the testimonies is the federal government was not interested in studying this group of people. They were interested in beating them.
That phenomenon you describe is very much akin, I'd say, to conspiracy theorists, where once they've baked in that idea, anything that they're presented with that counters that only basically fuels the conspiracy. They dismiss things that counter it and they elevate things that support it. And what I found interesting in terms of understanding the convoy, and that was a big reason that I wrote my book, is I felt that people were not getting the complexity of this, is that people who were part of that movement kind of saw it as being a feature and not a bug, that they were not monolithic and that there was no central hierarchy and that they couldn't order anyone to do anything and that it was very grassroots. And it was interesting that ended up becoming one of the key arguments against them in the commission hearings, especially when it came to this negotiation that had taken place between convoy organizers in the city of Ottawa. The government's position was, yeah, but I mean, by their own admission, they weren't a homogenous group. They couldn't force anyone to do anything. So that disjointed nature actually became, to the government's view, a liability of the convoy.
Yeah. So the question that comes up is, why should the federal government talk to anyone in this group? Because they can't bring anyone along with them.
Yeah, even if they sat down with Tamara Leach and worked things out, there's no guarantee that extends to the other however many thousands of people were there.
Yeah, it's like pushing a string uphill. And that might be true. But what I think I'm going to end up writing in a longer piece of journalism that is coming is that nobody owns virtue in this debate. Nobody was entirely right. It's going to be frustrating for a lot of people who are looking for a winner and a loser, a hero and a villain. But it is striking that the federal government was not against negotiating with any of these protesters. They were against federal officials negotiating with the principals, but they were super happy to have people from the city of Ottawa negotiating with them. Mm-hmm. So they were all for having proxies talk to the protesters. They were less excited about doing it themselves. And the proxies, the people from the city of Ottawa, especially the then mayor's chief of staff, were furious about this. We take it on the chin for sitting down with these people, and meanwhile they're complaining about federal politicians, federal policies, and the city of Ottawa didn't like being put in that position. So, so I've asked myself, hey, smarty pants, if you, Paul Wells, were the Prime Minister of Canada at this time, would you sit down and talk to anyone? I think the answer is no. Would you, as Prime Minister, designate someone to talk to them? It's not as clear to me that remember during the Oka crisis, not a perfect analogy, but the provincial Minister of Justice sat down and talked to masked Indigenous protesters. The whole point of negotiation is you do it with people who disagree with you. You don't do it with people who agree with you. That's called agreement.
Looking at, yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that one of the big, if we were to take a parallel history here and see what would have happened if, the question that I'm very curious about is what would have happened if the government had not settled on as clear a narrative as they took, with the fringe minority with unacceptable views, the standing with swastikas, really leaning into that. Because certainly my sense covering the convoy is that people were more frustrated with that than they were with vaccine mandates themselves a week into it. It's that, Justin Trudeau's response to this, the government's response to this, actually started to inflame more pushback. Now, it's entirely possible that wouldn't have made a difference, that, the government just standing up and saying, we condemn this protest, this is a lawless protest, it would have been the same. But do you think that was a policy, or do you think that was a political decision for the government to lean into that narrative, or do you think that was just what they believed?
I mean, I can't really know. But I'll say something, because I've been fairly agreeable until now, but I'll tell you who would be inclined to not like truckers who strongly disagreed with them about vaccine policy. It would be Justin Trudeau, because in the summer of 2020, a guy drove a truck halfway across the country and onto the lawn of his residence, the Prime Minister's residence, in a vehicle that contained several loaded long guns. So that is the sort of incident that the rest of us can shrug off or laugh off, or, but if someone had driven a truck up onto my lawn, I would tend and gotten arrested with a lot of weaponry, I would be inclined to remember that and to integrate it into my thinking about people who disagreed on vaccine policy driving large vehicles, And you can also bet that the most lurid examples of extremism and unpredictability were the subjects of intelligence reports that were getting to the Prime Minister's staff. And I guess what I reproach in the Prime Minister is he was unable or unwilling to realize that this wasn't many thousands of people like that. It was many thousands of people who had ways of expressing a disagreement that he might not have liked, but that everyone in this story was a Canadian is kind of the story that is kind of the conclusion that I draw. And caricaturing the other people in the story doesn't capture its complexity. I mean, so one of the things we both saw was that every group that came, the police of Ottawa, the RCMP, the federal government, the various levels of government, they were all dysfunctional. By the beginning of 2022, they were all exhausted. They were all operating on less than perfect information. So they were all making pretty lousy decisions. And we would be surprised to hear that anything else happened. I mean, by the beginning of 2022, if you tried to get a faucet fixed in your kitchen, the repair company would send over somebody bedraggled and exhausted and almost in tears. Like that's just the way life was at the beginning of this year.
Yeah, nothing worked.
Yeah, exactly. And once you get away from trying to pin blame, you notice elements of the human story, like just the fact that like Peter Stoley begins to cry in his testimony when he was talking about how cold it was. Like that was also a thing that was going on.
Yeah, and some of the Convoy volunteers and supporters that I kind of was following on Twitter and whatnot around then were sort of laughing at that, because they were saying, well, yeah, we were cold too. That was the whole point of it. But you are right that was exacerbating something that in Ottawa, the police did not feel they were prepared for. And I think that was one of the big failings here, is that in Ottawa, you had this sense that no one was taking the convoy at its word here. When they said, yeah, we're all driving to Ottawa and we're all going to stay there for as long as it takes. Like that was something that no one in the policing side of it, certainly not the Ottawa police, really bought.
Yeah. Well, and I think the police had different narratives. And it's also interesting to me that kind of the relative gold standard in terms of police intelligence and response to large high conflict events was the Ontario Provincial Police. Frankly, because they'd had a lot of practice. And
a very different approach from the Ottawa Police Service throughout.
Very much so. And although the OPP got along pretty well with the RCMP, also a different approach from the RCMP. Who are the OPP? They are the police who aren't in the big cities in Ontario. So they're the police from hockey country, essentially, and fishing country. And, they live on highways. They eat in restaurants where a lot of the protesters would eat. They, watch the same shows. They, are on the same Facebook groups. And a lot of big city folks were surprised and concerned to learn that the OPP knew a lot of had spoken to a lot of the protesters and sometimes showed some sympathy for how they went about their day. But it would be amazing if that wasn't the case. There's almost nobody in the OPP lives in downtown Toronto. And so they had different reflexes from anyone else.
That's quite a brilliant analysis of that. And I hope you expand on that a bit in your book, because I do think that, there was one story that I wrote a few weeks back that was based on an audio file of a recording that I got between OPP and convoy organizers, in which the OPP were actually apologizing for the Ottawa police fuel raid at the time. And that was the point where the Ottawa police or the Ontario provincial police liaison sort of took a step back and said, okay, we're not really in the mix here. And the sense that we really got throughout the course of the Public Order Emergency Commission testimony is that the OPP really felt like they could use engagement to get through this. And were you able to identify the point at which the Ottawa police said, yeah, that's not going to do it anymore?
Well, that fuel can thing was hotly contested within the OPS. There were people who thought that it was time to get serious about enforcement, and there were people who said that's exactly the wrong thing. I'm blanking on the name of the 3-letter acronym for the group within the police that would negotiate.
The PLT?
Yeah, the PLT, the whole PLT approach, which was don't enforce, discuss, and would often skate up to the line of being palsy-walsy with these protesters. And other police officers were not familiar with that whole approach. And it's frankly shocking to people who didn't like the convoy at all. And I kind of get that. Again, I sort of want to remind everyone that just about every official who testified at this commission spoke about getting death threats. This event was, among other things, a machine for generating death threats. And Tamara Leach said she got death threats too, and I absolutely believe that. But we should, as a society, avoid events that lead to everyone being involved receiving death threats, and that was another part of this story. So, another thing that has occurred to me that is that the lawyer Paul Champ, who represented the Ottawa's downtowners who took out an injunction against them, his clientele resembles the truckers more closely than it resembles any other clientele. Paul Champ's clients were not rich. They're mostly were not federal public servants. They're mostly people who work in the service industry in the downtown of a city where the downtown neighborhoods are not the rich neighborhoods. And they were just fed up. They were fed up in a different way at a different time in their lives than the protesters who'd come to town. But they also felt helpless. And I have read read and heard a lot of caricatures about what sort of people live in downtown Ottawa. And they come from people who cannot have ever spent time in downtown Ottawa. I don't live in downtown Ottawa.
Yeah, and I'm sort of guilty of that myself, not on an individual level, but sort of when I go to Ottawa, because I lived there very briefly, 12, 13 years ago. And when I go to Ottawa, I remember that, oh yeah, there are people here that aren't just people that live and work in these few square blocks. There are people that do any of the other things that are in a city of the size of Ottawa. And it is easy, especially if you only your only experience in Ottawa is on, Wellington Street or a couple of blocks around there. And I think that's a fair enough point. And, I think there were some people that I heard from that were Ottawa residents that were supportive of the convoy's aims, but not like, okay, guys, yeah, I'm with you, but, get off my street, that sort of thing. And I don't know how many of those there were, but it's understandable that there would have been some. Let me just ask you about Justin Trudeau's testimony here very briefly, Paul, because I thought that he did very well, given the circumstances. I thought that he was the last one, so every bit of evidence that was going to come up was already on the table. I wasn't sure if we were going to get the really annoying press conference Justin Trudeau or something else, and we got something else. I mean, he sounded very candid. He was giving short yes or no answers at various points, and I thought again, I didn't agree with his justification, but I felt he gave as clear a justification as he could have for what his position is.
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting. He was really superbly prepped to the point where he wasn't just playing the cassette, but he could improvise. And when good lawyers pushed at him on various points of detail, he was able to push back. He was also clearly part of a team. He was also clearly part of a well-rehearsed effort. One day I might find out how many people in this government were working on prepping the ministers and the prime minister for their testimony. But I was at Halifax at the Halifax Security Forum, and Jody Thomas, the prime minister's national security advisor, was at Halifax, as she would normally have been expected to be. It's an important conference. She had a earbud in her ear the whole night because she was listening to Janice Charette, the clerk of the Privy Council, testify live. And she was not paying that much attention to what was happening in front of her because she was part of this team that was following the testimony. So what was Trudeau's role? He had to bat cleanup on two outstanding points. One was this CSIS test that did the level of turmoil rise to the level specified in the CSIS Act for a public order emergency. And the other was this supposed February 13th plan that the Ottawa police had finally cobbled together to, in concert with the OPP and the RCMP. Trudeau's task was to bomb those two bridges, to say the CSIS test was absolutely met, and the February 13th plan that would have meant there was no need for the Emergencies Act was a lousy plan. And on those 2 points, I don't think he was persuasive. But it was impressive that he went in with those two things in mind, and he made the most vigorous case they could concoct on those 2 points. It shows, as I say, the level of preparation that every federal official showed up with. I mean, contrast that with poor Brenda Lucki, the RCMP commissioner, who seems to have been cut loose because she was not prepped at all.
Yeah, and I actually have wondered, because early on I sort of assumed that there would have to be a fall guy or a fall gal in this. And I was convinced early on it might have been Marco Mendicino, just because he was the one that was really sent out to sell this fairly aggressively when it was all happening. And now I just wonder if it'll just be Brenda Lucki when all is said and done.
Or maybe they don't need a fall guy, because the thing that's a little surprising is that the public opinion polling on this has been rock solid.
Yeah.
And the support for the use of the Emergencies Act has been solidly higher than general support for the Liberal Party against its opponents. So that would tend to tell you that the use of the Emergencies Act and the long discussion about whether it was proper to use the Emergencies Act has actually been pulling the Liberals up in the polls.
Now, what do you attribute that to? Because my instinct would be to say that the media's characterization of the convoy has contributed to that perception, but you may have a wildly different one.
I mean, the thing is, I can sort of believe that in the spring, when everyone's watching on TV and they're seeing round the clock, quite alarmist coverage of what sort of characters these protesters were. But months and months and months later, when we've all turned the page and we're all stuck in a courtroom, listening to testimony, seeing different levels of government disagreeing with each other, seeing cabinet ministers joking about putative colleagues behind their back and making jokes about sending tanks in. I think it's basically that months later, it's hard to demonstrate it's hard to point to large numbers of Canadians whose lives were ruined by the Emergencies Act. There are still figures who are still facing criminal charges, and they're having to defend themselves, and that's unpleasant for them. And we'll see how that turns out. But there aren't whole classes of Canadians who have no access to their bank accounts, as it seemed it might be the case early on. And then something else that doesn't get remarked on is the convoy didn't win because they didn't get a change to policy immediately while they were in Ottawa. But all month long, while people were testifying in that hearing room at the National Archives, everyone in that room was coughing. Nobody was wearing masks. Everyone had cough drops rattling around in the back of their mouths. No mask, less prominent use of vaccines. Everyone getting along according to their own conception of the rules, rather than according to fixed rules that were handed down by government. That's the way we were all living our lives, this autumn. And so I think that might lead just about everyone to realize that the really blatant, direct confrontation that was symbolized by the convoy versus the police and the governments and so on is not the way we're actually living our lives now. And maybe people are chilling out a bit.
That is very well said. And I think a perfect note to end on here. We might not agree on everything about the convoy, but I think your perspective on the commission and the broader story here is a really important one. You are doing fantastic work over at your Substack. That is at paulwells.substack.com. And I know you've got your take on this coming out in just a couple of months through Sutherland Quarterly. And I'm glad that Ken White has asked you to do that, or rope you into it, whichever is the most accurate description. But Paul, thanks very much, and Merry Christmas to you.
Thanks. Merry Christmas to you.
That was Paul Wells. And like I say, you don't need to agree with someone to appreciate their analysis and perspective on this. Paul has always been very fair and even keel on this, and I'm glad that he was suffering through the Public Order Emergency Commission as well. I'm glad that my publisher, Ken White, has tapped him to do this. So that's something you'll want to read. And I think his point is actually probably one that will withstand the test of time, that no one comes out squeaky clean on this. I mean, the whole nature of the convoy is that it was grassroots. Anyone could have just showed up, and by and large, many people did just show up. So you couldn't be accountable for what every single individual there did, which is why the organizers, people like Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, constantly put out the message that this is a peaceful protest. And I think that where history is clear is that it remained that until the very end. That does it for us for today. We've got to wrap things up there, but I will say thank you very much. This is our last program before Christmas, so I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. We'll be back next week with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.